Have you ever seen a dog refuse to leave a place long after everyone else is gone? In the heart of Alaska's icy wilderness, a German shepherd named Ghost lay beside a forgotten monument, day after day, year after year, guarding something no one could explain. He never barked, never chased, never begged. He simply waited, watched, protected. Some say he was just a dog. Others believe he was something more, a silent messenger from another world. What was he guarding? And why does his paw print still stay warm in the snow? Have you ever wondered if God still sends miracles to the world today? If you believe that God still speaks through love, faithfulness, and the things we least expect, follow this story to the end. And if your heart is touched, leave an amen in the comments below. Please hit that subscribe button so I can send you more amazing stories. Thank you so much for that. Anchorage, Alaska. March had arrived, but spring felt like a distant dream. The sky hung low, slate gray and unmoving, casting an eerie pall over the snow-covered streets. Wind howled like some ancient spirit down the empty alleys between buildings coated in salt and frost. Snow flurries danced like ashes over the Chugach Mountains, which loomed in the distance like silent, frozen guardians. At Elmendorf-Richardson Air Base, amidst the cold hum of servers and blinking satellite monitors, a discovery was made that would unravel a forgotten history and awaken something that was never meant to return. Dr. Daniel Carter, age 42, stood inside the command room of the Arctic Geospatial Division, hands jammed into the pockets of his Navy field coat. Tall and wiry with tousled brown hair streaked prematurely with gray, he had the drawn face of a man who had spent too much of his life reading data instead of resting. His eyes, steel blue and alert, missed little, though they often held a guarded sadness. Daniel was not the kind of man to speak unnecessarily, but when he did, his voice carried the calm of someone who had spent years balancing on the edge of impossible truths. Once, a decade ago, he'd led a recovery mission near the Mariana Trench that uncovered a Cold War relic no one could explain. Since then, he'd become the go-to man for projects off the books, especially the ones that shouldn't exist. Today, however, even he felt uneasy. A technician approached with stiff shoulders and a printout clutched in her gloved hand. Dr. Carter, you might want to see this. The images were grainy at first, heat signatures distorted by ice and time. But beneath 70 meters of glacial compression, the outlines became impossible to ignore. A long cylindrical body, faint metallic glints, protrusions unmistakably shaped like periscopes. A submarine. Not just any submarine. Based on preliminary matching, it was the Kriegsmarine U-boat U-324, reported missing in April 1944. It had vanished with no distress signals, no survivors, no wreckage, nothing. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the freezing control room. Where exactly? West face of the Chugach, she replied. Buried between twin ice shelves, completely unreachable by air until last month's melt shift. He nodded once. Alert the NSF, and get me on the line with Admiral Pierce. 2 hours later, a secure call from the Pentagon confirmed what he already suspected. He'd been assigned as mission lead. The National Science Foundation would provide Arctic excavation specialists. The U.S. Navy would supply transport and backup. Timeline: 2 weeks to mobilize, 3 to recover, and above all, discretion. As Daniel walked back through the wind-battered corridor toward his truck, something tugged at the edge of his consciousness. He had worked with classified wreckage before, crashed satellites, lost drones, even Soviet spy equipment. But this felt older, wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. That night, while picking up gear at a local military surplus shop in Midtown Anchorage, he heard a low whimper from the alley behind the store. Curious, he followed the sound until he found a dog, thin, frost-covered, its breath ragged, yet its eyes sharp and impossibly focused. The dog was a German shepherd, likely 4 or 5 years old, with a deep golden-brown coat streaked with soot and dirt. One of its ears was torn at the tip, and a faint scar crossed over its muzzle, giving it the appearance of a soldier who had survived more battles than it cared to remember. It didn't flinch when Daniel approached, only stared, right into him, as though recognizing something ancient and burdened. Daniel crouched. "Hey boy." The dog stepped forward, unafraid. Around its neck was a cracked leather collar, no tags. Just a faded engraving in barely legible print. Ghost. And somehow the name fit. The vet Daniel called confirmed Ghost had no chip and no visible signs of owner abuse. Only neglect and time. Daniel didn't think twice. He signed the adoption papers the next morning. The receptionist at the clinic, a chatty woman with bright red hair and a crush on weathered men with tired eyes, joked, "You two look like you've seen the same ghosts." Daniel just smiled thinly. "Maybe we have." The days passed quickly in preparation. Satellite recons confirmed the submarine's location. A transport route was mapped. Specialized thermal drills were prepped. And Ghost, silent, obedient, yet eerily perceptive, rarely left Daniel's side. He seemed to understand when to be still and when to alert. Once, he even barked without reason at the lab monitor when the image of the submarine appeared on screen. The bark wasn't angry. It was warning. Daniel began to notice strange things. Ghost would stop suddenly during walks and stare into the horizon, toward the mountains, toward the ice. At night, he'd growl lowly at nothing visible. And in dreams, Daniel kept seeing frozen corridors, echoing footsteps, and distant howls that sounded almost human. One evening, while reviewing World War II maritime records at his cabin near Lake Hood, Daniel stumbled across something buried in British naval logs. A single entry, dated April 2nd, 1944. A distress signal was received over encrypted channels from U-324 before it vanished. The last recorded transmission read simply, "We are not alone. God forgive us. The ice moves." Outside, Ghost raised his head and howled. The wind had begun to pick up. Storms were rolling in early. A white veil covered the ridges of Chugach like freshly shaken ash. Daniel looked out through the frosted window. The sky was darker than before. The world, it seemed, was holding its breath. Something beneath the ice had waited long enough. The sky above Anchorage had faded into a uniform wash of gray, a colorless ceiling pressing down on the world below. The temperature had dropped to -30, and a biting wind scraped across the landscape like shards of broken glass. Snow blew sideways in long, stinging ribbons across the frozen tarmac where two convoy vehicles idled, engines grumbling like reluctant beasts. Dr. Daniel Carter adjusted the thermal hood of his parka and gave a quiet nod to the two technicians loading the last of the equipment. Inside the lead snow crawler sat Ghost, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on the northern horizon, his breath fogging the interior glass with slow, deliberate exhalations. Ghost had barely moved since they arrived at the NSF research compound on the outskirts of Anchorage, an unassuming collection of prefabricated metal modules lashed together against the wind. He was unusually still, even for him, as if something in the distant whiteness beyond the ridgeline had called out to instincts older than language. Daniel had noticed that ever since Ghost had first seen the satellite image of the sub, his demeanor had changed. He wasn't restless. He was waiting. Inside the mess hall, the rest of the team gathered over hastily rehydrated meals and steaming mugs of bitter coffee. One of the new arrivals was Nora McAllister, the field engineer in charge of deep sensor calibration. She was in her late 30s, lean and sharp-featured, with dark auburn hair pinned into a tight twist under her insulated cap. Her eyes, green, flecked with gold, moved constantly, scanning, measuring, anticipating. Nora spoke little unless prompted, and even then, her words were clipped, efficient, her tone professional with just a trace of underlying melancholy. She moved like someone carrying invisible weight. Daniel had worked with her once before, 5 years ago during an oil rig collapse off the Aleutian coast. Back then, she'd been different. Quicker to smile, less guarded. That had been before the accident that claimed her son, 7-year-old Michael, lost to an ice crevasse during a family expedition. Search parties found nothing but his tiny boot, half buried in the snow. Since then, Nora had thrown herself into work like it was penance. Now, as she leaned against the snow crawler beside Daniel, her gaze followed Ghost's line of sight. "He's been staring like that for an hour," she said softly. Daniel glanced sideways at her. Since we got here, actually. It's like he's tracking something we can't see. Nora folded her arms, the wind pushing the edges of her jacket against her slender frame. You ever notice how dogs react to earthquakes before the tremors hit? Sometimes I think they feel the world differently, like the way kids do. Her voice faltered slightly on the last sentence. She didn't look at him when she said it. Daniel nodded, not pressing further. He's not just any dog. No, Nora murmured. He's not. They set out the next morning, just after sunrise, though in Alaska that time of year, sunrise was a faint glow struggling behind layers of storm cloud. The convoy consisted of 2 snow crawlers, an all-terrain radar sled, and a drone deployment van trailing behind like a metal insect. The vehicles moved slowly across the tundra, their treads leaving deep scars in the endless white as they climbed the first of the glacier ridges. Inside the crawler, Daniel sat next to Ghost, who had taken position by the side window, ears perked, gaze never breaking from the northern ridgeline. 3 hours into the journey, Nora tapped Daniel on the shoulder and gestured to the digital monitor attached to her lap. "Look at this," she said. The seismic sensor feed showed fluctuations, tiny ones, rhythmic in pattern. These are stress fractures in the ice, but they're too consistent, like something's moving beneath the surface. Slowly. Daniel leaned in. "Natural?" She shook her head. "No, not like this." Behind them, in the second crawler, Lieutenant Caleb Hart drove in silence. A Navy logistics specialist with a build like a brick wall and the temper of a resting bear, he rarely spoke unless necessary. Short-cropped blonde hair, thick neck, and hands that looked better suited to swinging hammers than steering, Caleb was, nonetheless, a surprisingly thoughtful observer. He had joined the mission reluctantly, pulled from a desk assignment in Fairbanks where he'd been trying to transfer closer to his ailing mother in Ohio. "It's just a boat in the ice," he'd told Daniel during the pre-brief. "But if it's got ghosts, I'm not babysitting your mutt." Now watching the snow crawler ahead of him weave toward the next ridge, he muttered to himself, "Boat or not, this place gives me the damn creeps." By mid-afternoon, a storm front rolled in faster than forecasted. Visibility dropped to near zero, forcing the convoy to halt on the side of a wind-scoured basin. They set up camp, deploying thermal barriers and collapsing snow shelters. Ghost refused to go inside any of them. Instead, he stood by the edge of the wind wall, body tense, hackles raised, not in fear but vigilance. As Nora adjusted the external sensors on the drone sled, she glanced again at Ghost, who now paced a slow arc around the edge of camp. "He's keeping watch," she whispered. Daniel zipped his coat and joined her. "For what?" Nora's voice lowered. "I don't know, but I've seen that kind of pacing before, when my son got too close to the edge of the crevasse." The family's husky blocked his path, growled, almost lunged at him to keep him from stepping forward. My husband thought it was aggression. We turned to scold the dog. By the time we turned back, her voice caught. Daniel didn't reply. He simply stood beside her as the wind rose, howling like something lost and searching. And Ghost just kept watching the north. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence blanketing the vast white nothingness that surrounded the convoy. Morning in the Arctic didn't come with sunrises, only a gradual lifting of the gloom into a dim, ghostly twilight that blurred every horizon. The snow had settled in thick drifts along the base of the ice ridge, and the wind was now a whisper instead of a scream. But that silence, it felt too deliberate, too heavy, like something was holding its breath. Daniel Carter stood outside the tent, scanning the landscape through a pair of thermal binoculars. The data from the night before continued to haunt him. He had reviewed the seismic records 3 times already, and each time they formed the same pattern: shifting stress points in the ice, curved lines that didn't make sense geologically. Not random, not natural. The Earth was trying to speak, and they just didn't yet know how to listen. Ghost, as always, stood a few feet ahead, his body still and taut. He hadn't slept through the night, only pacing the perimeter of the camp, pausing often to sniff the air or stare northward. That morning, he had begun growling low under his breath, ears flattened and tail stiff. Something had changed. Inside the radar sled, Nora McAllister wiped the condensation from a digital tablet screen. She had spent the past hour tracing and mapping the seismic anomalies again. What she saw now gave her pause. Along one of the ridge lines, the anomalies formed a distinct loop, spaced consistently repeating. Almost like footsteps. Enormous ones. Caleb Hart entered the sled cabin behind her, holding 2 thermos mugs of instant coffee. "You look like you found God in those readings," he said with a raised brow. Nora barely glanced at him. "No, but I think I found something that thinks it is." Caleb, not a man easily unnerved, frowned. "Explain." She turned the screen toward him. "These aren't tremors. Their weight shifts left, right, left again. Something heavy is walking out there. Same route, over and over again. Like patrols. Animal migration?" Nora shook her head. "Too precise. Too regular. These tracks, they aren't just fresh. They're embedded deep in the ice. Generations deep." As if on cue, Ghost began barking, sharp, violent bursts that sliced through the quiet like gunshots. Daniel dropped his binoculars and sprinted toward him, followed by Nora and Caleb. Ghost had moved up to the edge of a minor ice ridge and stood with his paws pressed into the snow, barking toward a patch of undisturbed white that seemed perfectly ordinary. But then the snow shifted, subtle at first. Daniel stepped forward slowly, scanning the surface. "Don't move," he said sharply. "This crust is thinner than it looks." Too late. A crack echoed underfoot, and the snow at his left gave way. Caleb lunged forward instinctively, grabbing Daniel's coat and yanking him backward, just in time to see a chunk of the ridge collapse into a chasm below. The wind rushed up from the void with a deep groan like the moan of the earth itself. The crevasse beneath was jagged, deep, and black. The team peered over the edge carefully, and Caleb muttered, "Another few steps and you'd be a popsicle at the bottom of that thing." Daniel knelt beside Ghost and scratched behind his ears. "You knew it was there," he whispered. Ghost didn't respond, just stared into the distance again, alert. Later that afternoon, as the group established temporary anchors to mark the danger zone, Nora ventured to the far end of the exposed ice face. Something had caught her eye, a series of lines half covered in frost and snow, etched deeply into the ice wall. She brushed the surface gently with her gloved hands, revealing a geometric symbol, angular and repetitive, yet organic, like a tree branching and fracturing. Her heart began to pound. She took out her phone and snapped several images, sending them wirelessly to her tablet. Then she unzipped her inner jacket pocket and removed a faded leather notebook, her father's. Professor Matthew McAllister had been an Arctic linguist and archaeologist, and 20 years ago he had vanished during an expedition in Nunavut. His last correspondence to her included sketches of strange ice glyphs. She remembered tracing them with her fingers as a teenager, wondering what they meant. Now those same markings, nearly identical, were here at this remote ridge. She didn't speak for several minutes. Not until Daniel joined her and saw the frozen look on her face. "What is it?" he asked. She showed him the notebook. Daniel studied the drawing next to the carvings. "Identical," he said. "My father disappeared near sites with markings like this," she whispered. "He always believed something older than us was buried beneath the Arctic. I thought it was grief talking. Now I'm not so sure." Caleb arrived moments later with 2 support crew members. Marcus Hale, a former mountaineering guide turned ice safety expert, and Leanne Choate, a compact but tough climatologist with shoulder-length blonde hair and a sharp New Jersey accent. Marcus was in his 50s, tall, olive-skinned, with a beard now flecked with gray. He was pragmatic, soft-spoken, and always evaluating risk. Leanne, in contrast, was talkative, skeptical, and unafraid to speak up. Leanne squinted at the carvings. "I don't care if it's alien, ancient, or leftover tourist graffiti. It doesn't belong this far inland. No known civilization made it past these ranges, and no ice formation should preserve something this detailed." Marcus crouched to run his fingers over the edge. "This isn't just preserved," he said slowly. "It's fresh, as if something kept it from eroding." Nora said nothing. She was already forming a theory she didn't dare speak aloud. That evening, around the campfire inside the shelter, Nora sat quietly rereading her father's final expedition journal. She traced the lines of his last entry. The symbols are a warning, not a record. Something moves beneath the frost, something they feared. If we uncover what they tried to hide, we will not survive it. Outside, the wind had died again. The world had gone still. Ghost stood at the edge of camp, unmoving, his silhouette etched against the dim Arctic haze. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the ancient footprints remained, waiting. The fourth morning in the ice fields broke with a strange clarity. For the first time in days, the clouds had parted enough to allow a dim shaft of sunlight to spill across the frozen plain, casting long shadows over the excavation site. The air, however, remained brutally cold, sharp and dry enough to sting the lungs with every breath. The ice beneath the team's boots groaned with weight, as if the very earth disapproved of what they were about to uncover. The radar sled had done its job. After 3 days of coordinated drilling, melting, and seismic mapping, the curved metallic shape that had haunted the satellite scans now jutted from the ice like the rib of some ancient beast. Its hull was dark steel, pocked with frost and age, but unmistakable in form. The conning tower stood rigid, its periscope broken at the tip, frozen in time like a war monument no one ever built. Across the side, through layers of snow-dusted grime, the barely visible remnants of painted silver showed the symbol they had all dreaded, the faded swastika of the Kriegsmarine. Daniel Carter stood at the edge of the trench, eyes narrowed behind frost-streaked goggles. The unease he had carried since Anchorage had not subsided. In fact, standing before the sub only magnified it. "There's no external damage," he said, more to himself than to the others. "No torpedo hits, no collapse. It's intact." Ghost remained behind him, ears pinned back, growling low but steady. His front paws refused to touch the ice directly surrounding the submarine, as though something invisible prevented him. He circled in place, then sat down facing the wreck, tail twitching in agitation. Nora McAllister approached slowly, eyes on the metal surface. "So, how does a Nazi U-boat vanish without a trace and reappear in perfect condition under 70 meters of ice?" "No wreckage, no escape attempt," Daniel muttered. "No explanation." Caleb Hart leaned over the edge with a flashlight and scanned the hull. "It looks like it was placed here, not sunk. Like something lifted it and set it down in the ice." "That's not the weirdest part," came a new voice behind them. Everyone turned as a new member of the team walked toward the trench. Ethan Sawyer, 51, was the mission's civilian military historian, assigned to catalog the cultural and historical value of the wreck. He was a lanky man with pale skin and sharp features, usually hidden behind round spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose. A long wool scarf fluttered in the wind from beneath his parka, a habit he had refused to give up from his Oxford days. Ethan had an academic's soul, but his eyes betrayed someone who had once seen too much, perhaps during his work documenting Nazi occult programs unearthed in Eastern Europe. He adjusted his glasses and gestured toward the conning tower. That model was last seen on U-234 and a few other long-range experimental vessels. They were rumored to be on what the Third Reich called relic missions. High secrecy. No survivors. Nora arched an eyebrow. "Relic?" Ethan nodded, kneeling to brush snow away from the insignia. "They believed they could find artifacts buried in the Arctic that predated Christianity. Old symbols. Forgotten gods. There are Nazi records from 1943 that reference Die WWII, the Keepers of the Ice." Daniel folded his arms. "I thought that was just a myth." Ethan smiled faintly. "So did most historians. Until you showed me those glyphs yesterday." Nora pulled her notebook from her jacket and handed it to Ethan. He turned the pages slowly, his breath catching when he saw her father's sketches side by side with the carvings uncovered near the crevasse. "Exactly as the Thule Society described them," he whispered. "It wasn't about military dominance. These missions were about retrieval." Caleb scoffed. "You're telling me Nazis came up here to steal gods?" Ethan stood, brushing snow off his knees. "They didn't come to steal. They came to contain. There were stories, even back in the Middle Ages, about things buried under the ice that weren't meant for man to find. The Norse called them the Frost Watchers. The Inuit had a term too, Kimmernat, the silent ones who wait. Always watching. Daniel watched Ghost, who hadn't taken his eyes off the submarine since their arrival. If they were trying to contain something, why bury it with their own crew? Ethan hesitated. Maybe they didn't have a choice. They spent the rest of the day documenting the hull's exterior and establishing anchor lines around the perimeter. Ground-penetrating radar showed that the submarine was more than 90% intact, including all lower compartments. But they agreed not to open any hatches until full atmospheric pressure checks could be done. For now, it remained sealed, a tomb of steel in a frozen grave. At sunset, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The team retreated to their shelters, except for Ghost, who refused to follow. He stayed perched on the ice wall, staring silently at the conning tower. Occasionally, his ears would twitch as though he heard something deep beneath the surface. In the main tent, Ethan set up his station beside the heater, poring over older expedition reports. He glanced at Daniel and said, "I never told you what happened to the last crew that tried to reach you. 864 off Norway's coast. 2 of the divers refused to descend. The third went mad, kept screaming about voices under the hull, whispering in languages no one had heard before." Daniel rubbed his temples. "So what are you suggesting?" Ethan looked at him grimly. "That some tombs were built not to be opened, but to be locked." Outside, a sudden gust of wind howled across the plain, but it didn't sound natural. It wasn't the usual sharp whistle of Arctic wind, but a lower note, resonant, almost vocal. And Ghost began to growl again. The decision to enter the submarine was not made lightly. After days of scanning, monitoring atmospheric readings, and testing ice integrity, the team gathered around the forward hatch of the U-324. It loomed before them like a sealed tomb, its outer bolts rusted but not degraded. There were no signs of explosive sealing or emergency escape attempts, only silence, as though the vessel had simply stopped. Dr. Daniel Carter stood at the front, his breath a steady mist in the sub-zero air, Ghost at his side, ears pressed flat and body rigid. The German shepherd refused to approach the hull and instead paced along the perimeter, his low growls constant, as if warning something beneath the ice. With effort, the hydraulic rig creaked and groaned as it pulled at the corroded locking mechanism. A faint hiss echoed across the trench as the inner air equalized. The scent that emerged was not foul in the traditional sense. It was old, metallic, and heavy with the weight of things long buried. Daniel climbed in first, followed by Nora McAllister and Ethan Sawyer, their headlamps piercing the darkness ahead. The submarine interior was strangely intact, preserved in unnatural stillness. They entered the control corridor first. Gauges, dials, and navigation panels lay untouched. Dustless. Frost clung to metal edges and crystalline vines, and everywhere, silence hung like a curtain. What disturbed them most was not what they found, but what they didn't. The crew. They were still there. Not in piles, not crumpled in terror. They sat at their stations, upright, still buckled, eyes closed, some with hands still hovering above control panels. One man, likely the radio operator, had his head resting gently against his shoulder, mouth slightly open as though he had simply fallen asleep. There were no signs of panic. No wounds. No frostbite. They were preserved, not dead in the traditional sense, but suspended in a moment of quiet that had lasted for nearly 8 decades. Nora's voice cracked as she whispered, "They never tried to leave." Ethan moved through the aisle slowly, camera in hand, documenting every position, every face. There are no distress calls recorded in naval logs. No mention of mechanical failure. This wasn't abandonment. This was containment. They reached the command room, the heart of the submarine. At the center, slouched in the captain's chair, was a man in a dark navy coat with silver braids still clinging to his shoulder. His jawline was firm, his eyes sunken but closed. In his gloved hands was a leather-bound logbook, pages stiff with ice and time. Daniel reached out, brushing frost away from the cover. Carved into the leather was a name barely legible, Captain Lieutenant Ewald Richter. The final entry was scrawled in a trembling hand, the ink smeared and uneven. Daniel opened to the last page. Wir sind nicht allein. Sie kommen. We are not alone. They are coming. The weight of the words sank through the air like falling snow. Ethan muttered a curse under his breath and stepped back. Nora leaned closer to examine the rest of the journal. Most entries detailed the voyage, standard patrol logs, navigational notes, mentions of northern pulses, followed by rapid mentions of hearing sounds at night, shifting ice patterns, and crew members reporting shadows outside the periscope even when submerged. The last dozen entries devolved into short, clipped sentences. We hear them. The air is wrong. They whisper when the lights go out. Otto disappeared last night. Footprints near hatch. Not ours. Daniel exhaled slowly and looked around the room again. No signs of struggle. No forced confinement. They sealed themselves in willingly. Or something sealed them, Ethan added grimly. They stayed inside for another 20 minutes, collecting data, uploading scans, and photographing every surface. When they finally exited the hatch, Daniel's face was pale beneath his frost-covered beard. Ghost was waiting, body still as a statue, eyes locked on the hull. He wouldn't come closer the whole time, Nora said softly. Daniel looked down at the dog, then at the ice around them. He knows something. That night, beneath a sky laced with northern lights, the team camped just beyond the excavation ridge. The light danced silently overhead, green and violet ripples stretching like cosmic warnings across the Arctic heavens. Most of the team retreated early, unnerved by what they'd seen inside the vessel. Only Ghost remained awake, pacing the snow, nostrils flaring, tail still. Nora couldn't sleep. She sat near the outer barrier, her father's notebook in hand, staring at the frozen trench beyond. Ghost appeared beside her without a sound and gently nudged her elbow. She blinked. What is it? He turned and trotted toward the snowfield behind the tent compound. At first, she hesitated, but something about his movement, calm but determined, compelled her to follow. He led her past the rear generators, past the edge of the equipment sled, and into a dip in the snow where the wind had carved a shallow basin. Ghost stopped, pawing lightly at the ice. Nora crouched down and began to dig with her gloves. Only a few inches beneath the surface, her fingers struck something hard, a small metal object, tarnished and half frozen. She cleared the frost. It was a child's necklace, a tiny silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon, its chain knotted and broken. Her hands began to shake. No, the same necklace she had given Michael for his 6th birthday, the one he had been wearing the day he vanished. Nora stood up too quickly, stumbling back, mouth open in disbelief. This can't be real, she whispered. Ghost only sat, watching her, eyes calm and ancient, as if waiting for her to understand something beyond explanation. She clutched the pendant tightly, chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. Had someone been here before? Had Michael wandered this far? Or had something brought it here? She didn't know. But Ghost did. The air inside the submarine had grown heavier since the discovery of the journal. Even the static of the monitoring equipment felt quieter, as though the hull itself was listening. Dr. Daniel Carter hadn't slept. His thoughts remained locked on that final scrawl. They are coming. He read it over and over, as if some subtle inflection in the words might reveal a truth the ink itself couldn't say aloud. By morning, the decision was made to investigate the lower decks. Ethan Sawyer had found a schematic of a storage compartment sealed under the engine room, an area not originally designed for long-term crew access. This wasn't part of the standard build, he said. It's reinforced, insulated separately. Not for cargo, for containment. The entrance was partially frozen shut, layers of old ice webbed across the trapdoor like roots. It took Marcus Hale, the mountaineering guide with a broad back and patient hands, nearly 40 minutes to chisel through the frost. He worked with practiced precision, beads of sweat freezing into crystals along the edge of his fur-lined hood. Marcus rarely spoke, but when he did, it came with weight. This wasn't meant to be reopened, he muttered. The hatch groaned as it gave way, exhaling a gust of stale air that reeked of ancient metal and earth. A ladder descended into the dark. Nora McAllister and Ethan followed Daniel down. The light from their headlamps caught on frost-covered pipes and aged rivets until, finally, they touched ground. It was a room no larger than a walk-in closet, lined in thick steel and layered with rubber insulation that had blackened with age. In the center sat a crate, about 4 feet long, 3 wide, made of a stone so dark it appeared to drink the light. Its surface was etched with symbols that pulsed with faint iridescence, their shapes alien, jagged, yet almost natural in their curvature, like something carved by wind or bone. Ethan dropped to one knee, his voice low. "This isn't German. This isn't anything I've ever seen. No symmetry. No language root. It predates everything." Daniel ran a gloved hand across the top. The stone felt warm, despite the surrounding cold. He recoiled slightly. "Is it radioactive?" Nora pulled out a handheld Geiger counter. The screen stayed flat. No radiation. Not even heat signature on thermal. "But it feels alive." Marcus remained at the top of the hatch, uneasy. "This thing's been buried for decades, maybe longer. We shouldn't touch it." But Ethan already had his fingers around the edge. "We have to know what's inside. This is why they died in that room above, protecting this." With a gentle pull, the lid shifted. "No mécanique là. No seams. Just movement." As it opened, a thick mist rose out, cold but not freezing. The vapor twirled unnaturally, like it moved with intent. The box's interior was lined with metal unlike anything they recognized. Neither steel nor copper. Dull black with veins of shimmering silver that seemed to rearrange themselves when viewed from different angles. At the center, resting on a carved pedestal, was a black orb the size of a grapefruit. Perfectly spherical. Perfectly silent. Then the lights flickered. Just once. But enough for the team above to notice. "Are you all right down there?" came Caleb Hart's voice through the radio. His tone was tight. Alert. Daniel picked up the orb with both hands. It was warm. Not scalding, comforting, like something once alive. He didn't speak for a long moment. Nora broke the silence. "You need to put it back." "No," Ethan whispered. "This is a key. I think, to something older than memory." Outside the submarine, Ghost stood as still as stone. He had not moved from his position since sunrise. His fur bristled in the wind, and his eyes were locked on the ridgeline beyond the trench, where snow danced like smoke across the ice. For a moment, brief but undeniable, something shifted in the fog. A silhouette, tall, wrong in proportion. Wolf-like, but upright. Its limbs too long, posture too still. Ghost didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply watched. And then the figure was gone. Later, when Nora climbed out of the hatch and stepped into the open air, she found Ghost exactly where she'd left him, facing the north. She moved beside him, her face pale, lips trembling. "What did you see?" she asked quietly. Ghost didn't answer, but his body remained taut with awareness, the way a predator does when something greater stalks nearby. That night, Daniel locked the orb inside a secured container and placed it within the heated analysis tent. Ethan stayed with it, documenting its every angle with slow, reverent precision. He spoke as if the object might respond. "This isn't technology. It's memory in solid form. Encoded. Waiting to be understood." Meanwhile, Marcus remained outside, checking the integrity of the trench walls. He was joined briefly by Leanne Choate, the climatologist with wild curls of blonde hair and a restless energy that never quite settled. She had been mapping the weather shifts and ice density around the submarine for the last 2 days, and now held a tablet in one gloved hand, expression tight. "You notice the melt rate?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "No," she turned the screen toward him. "It's accelerating. The ice around the trench is thinning faster than it should. Way faster. Something down there is radiating, not heat, exactly, but a presence." He frowned. "From that rock." Leanne looked at him, then toward the stars beginning to pierce through the Arctic night. "From whatever it used to be part of." As the temperature plummeted again, and the generators hummed with tension, Nora sat inside her tent holding the child's necklace she had unearthed. She traced its crescent edges with a thumb. In the faint light, She saw something impossible, tiny fingerprints in the frost along the silver chain, too small to belong to any adult. She blinked, but they were gone. The wind had returned, not in fierce howls but in a low, ceaseless moan that moved across the excavation site like a memory refusing to fade. The ice cracked beneath its breath, subtle but rhythmic, too consistent to be ignored. It was the kind of wind that made people speak in hushed tones and look over their shoulders without knowing why. In the early morning haze, the excavation team gathered inside the research shelter as Helena Brooks, their field biologist and Arctic fauna specialist, unrolled a series of transparent ice layers across the light table. The illuminated sheets revealed dozens of perfectly preserved wolf tracks, some recent, others buried deeper in the strata. Helena was in her early 40s, tall, with lean muscles shaped from years of field work in some of the harshest terrains in the world. Her dark hair was tied back in a tight braid, and her face bore the kind of sun-damaged lines earned by those who refused the safety of lab coats and offices. There was something intense in her movements, measured, calculating, like a predator assessing its surroundings. Helena had always relied more on instinct than protocol, a trait both respected and feared in her field. "These aren't just the tracks of one pack," she said, voice steady. "What we're seeing is a ritual passed down. The oldest prints we've extracted are embedded under layers that carbon date back over 70 years. And what's more, each layer shows the same path, same route, same rhythm." Ethan Sawyer leaned over the table, eyes narrowing behind his fogged glasses. "You're saying these wolves have been circling this site for generations?" Helena nodded. "Yes. This isn't migration or hunting behavior. This is memory." Caleb Hart grunted from the corner, arms crossed. "Wolves don't have memory like that." Helena turned to him, her tone sharper now. "Not human memory, but genetic, ritualistic, inherited behavior. What we're seeing here isn't instinct, it's duty." Ghost lay nearby, motionless except for the occasional twitch of his ear. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was shallow, as though he were listening through the earth itself. Nora sat quietly beside him, her fingers brushing against the small silver necklace tucked in her jacket pocket. Since the discovery of the child's pendant, she had barely spoken. She hadn't told anyone else, not yet. She was still trying to reconcile how something so personal, so connected to her past, could resurface in a place untouched by humans for decades. Ghost had known where to find it, and that alone haunted her more than the black orb resting in the containment box across the room. Helena continued her presentation. "Wolves typically adjust paths seasonally. Food patterns, temperature changes, territorial disputes, they all cause deviation. But here," she tapped the layered track lines, "they've walked the same exact route, year after year, generation after generation. They're guarding something." Daniel Carter had been silent until now. He stepped closer to the light table and looked at Ghost. "You think he's part of it?" Helena studied the dog with something akin to reverence. "His behavior suggests a bond stronger than training. He's not reacting. He's remembering." Ethan, who had spent the previous night documenting the black orb's shifting patterns, suddenly cleared his throat. "There's something else." He reached into his field bag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. Its edges were cracked, pages yellowed with time. "This belonged to my grandfather, Leonard Sawyer. He worked for the German Historical Preservation Office before the war and later was drafted into one of the Third Reich's research divisions. He vanished in 1942 on a classified mission to Greenland." He laid the journal on the table, flipping to a section marked by a faded cloth ribbon. The page was filled with hand-drawn sigils, angular, fragmented, yet unmistakably similar to those on the black orb. Daniel's voice dropped. "Those are the same." Ethan nodded slowly. According to his notes, these markings weren't German. The division he worked for believed they originated from a civilization that predated Indo-European settlements. They referred to them as Die Alten Wachter, the Ancient Watchers. Not gods, not demons, sentinels. Helena stepped back. "You think the orb belonged to them?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. He wrote about a site near the Arctic Circle. Said the ice there was alive. That it moved when you weren't looking. That animals refused to cross it. Caleb scoffed. And yet your grandfather went anyway. Ethan looked down. He never came back. The room fell into uneasy silence. Outside, the wind shifted. Ghost stood up suddenly and walked to the doorway. No bark. No growl. Just presence. Helena followed him. As she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a wall. Ghost moved slowly, deliberately, his paws crunching on untouched snow. She followed him past the edge of camp, where the field remained undisturbed. There, etched into the drift, was a single track, fresh, wide, precise. It hadn't been there minutes ago. A wolf print, but not like the others. It was deeper, longer. The claw impressions stretched unnaturally forward, almost like fingers. Helena crouched beside it, pressing her gloved hand against the shape. It was larger than her palm. She looked back at Ghost, whose eyes were locked on the horizon. "What are you remembering?" she whispered. Back in the shelter, Nora opened Ethan's journal again. Toward the back, she found an entry she hadn't noticed before. It was dated a week before his disappearance. The object must never be removed from ice. The wolves do not hunt, they guard. We mistook them for beasts. But they are not the prisoners. We are. The storm had lifted, but it wasn't peace that settled over the ice. It was absence. The wind, which had not ceased since the team's arrival, was suddenly gone. The air hung too still, too quiet, as though something vast had drawn breath and was now waiting to exhale. Snow no longer shifted across the ridgeline. Frost no longer creaked underfoot. The world had fallen into unnatural silence. Inside the operations tent, Caleb Hart tapped at the satellite comms module for the 5th time in the last hour. Still no signal. His thick brows furrowed beneath his thermal hood, and a fine sheen of frost clung to his beard. "Nothing," he muttered. "No uplink, no ping, not even static." Nora McAllister sat across from him, her eyes distant, pale fingers clenched around the child's necklace. She hadn't spoken much since yesterday, when she and Ghost had found the unnatural footprint in the snow. Now she looked thinner, as if the cold had carved lines into her that hadn't been there before. Her mind wasn't in the tent. It was somewhere between memory and the frost-covered veil that blurred the border of this world and something deeper. Ethan Sawyer stood by the containment box holding the black orb, scribbling notes on a clipboard while occasionally casting glances toward the sealed object. "We're being blocked," he said quietly. "The orbital satnet should be overhead every 90 minutes. Something's interfering." Leanne Choate, who had entered moments earlier carrying fresh thermal readings, tossed her data pad on the table. "That's not the only thing off." Temperature outside dropped another 6 degrees, but the thermal seal around the sub remains stable. It's like the cold is being redirected. Helena Brooks, who had barely said a word all morning, finally spoke from her position by the tent flap. "The wolves are gone." Everyone turned. She looked over her shoulder. "They've been circling us since day one. I could hear their padding at night, their breaths in the wind. But now, nothing. No tracks. No scent. It's like they were never here." Daniel Carter entered just then, face tight. His boots were rimmed with frost, and his gloved hands clutched a field scanner. "There's movement beneath the ice. Not seismic. Not tectonic. It's vertical." He looked at each of them. "Something's rising." Ghost had been the first to react. Moments earlier, he had darted from Nora's side and taken position directly in front of the submarine's main hatch, body low, ears pinned back, tail still. Not like a guard dog, like a sentinel. He didn't snarl, didn't bark, only stood, refusing to let anyone near the vessel. Daniel approached slowly, his breath forming short puffs in the freezing air. "Ghost," he whispered, kneeling. "What's down there?" Ghost didn't move. When Daniel tried to step closer, the dog bared his teeth, not in aggression but in warning. Behind him, Nora staggered slightly. Her voice, when it came, was small, brittle. "I saw him." Daniel turned. "Who?" She blinked slowly, her gaze unfocused. "Michael. My son. Last night. In my dream. He was standing on the ice, barefoot, no coat. But he wasn't cold. And he wasn't afraid. Ethan moved beside her, concern flashing in his features. A dream? She nodded, tightening her grip on the necklace. He wasn't alone. There were wolves. Not just watching, they were with him. Around him. Like he belonged. And he said, her throat caught. He said, "Mom, don't open it. Some things don't belong to us." No one spoke for a moment. Helena's voice broke the silence. "That's not just a dream, Nora." Daniel rose. "I agree." The team gathered around the map table, tracing their last communications and discussing their options. Caleb pushed for a recall, an attempt to hike back to the backup relay station 50 kilometers south. Ethan argued for staying. "If we leave now, we lose the site. And if what's inside that orb can answer even a fragment of its origin, we're talking about rewriting human history." "But at what cost?" Helena asked. Before anyone could respond, the ice beneath the sub cracked. Not a loud shatter, but a subtle groan, deep, like a sleeping creature stirring. Ghost lunged forward, placing himself directly between the team and the vessel's hull. The growl that rumbled from his chest was unlike anything they had heard before. Not canine, not entirely animal. It was deeper, older. Lights inside the command tent flickered, dimmed, then returned. The box containing the orb pulsed once, an almost imperceptible shimmer across its dark surface. Daniel reached for it, but Ghost's bark cracked through the silence like thunder. It was sharp, defiant. The dog refused to let him touch it. "Do you see it?" Nora whispered suddenly. Daniel turned to her. "See what?" She stepped outside the tent, walking slowly, dreamlike. "There, just beyond the ridge." They followed her gaze. In the distance, through the thinning mist, a figure stood on the ice. Too far to see clearly, yet close enough to feel. It was tall, impossibly still, shaped like a man but not quite right. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted slightly as if listening to some silent call. Then it vanished. Nora didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only said, "That's what he meant." They all knew then without words. Something had awakened beneath them, an ancient awareness that had waited through generations of snowfall and silence. The wolves had not been the guardians. They had been the gatekeepers. And now the gate was open. Ghost backed away from the orb and sat down, his head lowered but his eyes locked on the ice. He didn't move again for hours. By morning, the silence had grown suffocating. It was no longer just the absence of wind or wildlife. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the chest, as if the air itself had weight. The snow no longer fell. The frost no longer shimmered. The world had become still, not from peace, but from anticipation. Dr. Daniel Carter stood on the ridge above the excavation site, shoulders squared against the cold, his eyes fixed on the dark opening of the submarine. Below him, the trench yawned open like a scar in the earth, surrounded by frost-bitten equipment and shattered crates. The orb, now dormant, rested once again in its container, though no one dared touch it. They had all seen what followed. The decision had not come easily. The team had debated through the night, their voices low, tense, full of words like containment, abandonment, ethics, and legacy. But in the end, it was Carter who bore the weight of it. And as dawn broke, bruised and pale, he made the call. The site would be sealed. Permanently. He descended into the trench one final time, trailed by Marcus Hale and two Navy engineers flown in by emergency drop, Reese and Weller. Both were hardened men in their late 30s, field specialists from iceborne installations in Barrow. Reese was broad-shouldered and quiet, dark-skinned with a streak of silver in his hair that aged him beyond his years. Weller was lean and wiry, with a sarcastic edge and a twitch in his jaw when stressed. Neither asked questions. They had seen enough in their careers to obey orders that sounded insane, especially when a seasoned scientist like Carter gave them. While Reese unpacked the quick-set concrete polymer drums, custom-mixed for sub-zero environments, Weller prepped the sealing unit. The plan was simple. Fill the submarine and trench cavity with thermal-set concrete laced with anti-fracture mesh, entombing the U-324 and its contents in a tomb of synthetic stone. No one would ever open it again. Back at the research shelter, Ethan Sawyer sat hunched over his laptop, his glasses fogged and sliding down his nose. He had barely slept, fingers dancing across the keyboard as he decrypted, enhanced, and annotated the symbols copied from the orb. He had sent packets to multiple linguistic research centers and secretive antiquarian institutes. Only one had replied, an obscure institute in northern Italy, known only by its acronym, ORSA. The reply had been short and deeply unsettling. The symbols are real, not linguistic in nature but representational. They mark thresholds, bridges. Some cultures called them seals, others warnings. But most accurately, they are transit points between the living and the not born of this earth. Ethan read the message twice more before closing his laptop and stepping outside. The sky had shifted again. Where once there had been colorless gray, now it was pale blue. Too pale. A sky that didn't belong here. He watched as Daniel oversaw the final positioning of the chemical lines, then moved toward the edge of the trench, his hands in his pockets. "Are we doing the right thing?" Ethan asked quietly. Daniel didn't look away from the darkness below. "We're doing the only thing." Across the compound, Nora stood beside Ghost. The German shepherd had not left his post since the night before. His fur rippled gently in the cold, his breath slow, controlled. Nora rested a hand on his back. He didn't flinch. Instead, his head turned slowly to her, and in that gaze, steady, calm, unwavering, she saw resolution. Ghost knew the choice had to be made. As the concrete mixture began to pour, thick and steaming against the cold, the team worked in silence. No one spoke. Not because they didn't want to, but because there were no words appropriate for what was being buried. When it was done, they erected a monument, not grand, just a slab of black Arctic granite, hauled from nearby rock formations and etched by hand using a portable cutter. The inscription read, "In memory of those who stood between the world and what should not be. Let the ice keep its secrets." It bore no names, no affiliations. Only a single carved sigil from the orb, rotated and sealed into the stone like a brand. By late afternoon, the site was being cleared. Personal gear was packed. Samples were archived, encrypted, and locked into classified shipment containers. A heavy hush had settled over the team, the kind born not from trauma but revelation. The kind that doesn't pass quickly. As the last chopper prepared for liftoff, Carter stood at the edge of the new tomb, helmet in hand, gloves tucked into his belt. One by one, the others boarded. Helena, Caleb, Marcus. Nora paused last, looking back toward the ridge, and toward Ghost, who had not moved from his spot. He stood alone in the snow, facing the trench. Still, silent. "Ghost," she called. But he didn't follow. Daniel stepped beside her. "He's staying." Nora's brows furrowed. "Why?" Daniel's voice was low. "Because it isn't over. Not really." And so they left him there, a lone silhouette in the pale wilderness, fur whipping in the wind, eyes fixed on the stone seal below. Watching, keeping vigil. Years passed. The storm-ravaged ridges of Chugach remained as brutal as ever, scarred by snow, wind, and silence. Nature reclaimed what it could, though some things never truly belonged to it in the first place. The excavation site, now just a quiet rise of snow-dusted stone, stood untouched except by time. The black granite slab, the memorial, still bore its ancient sigil, now half buried under frost. Nothing around it stirred. No camps, no equipment, no signs of human life. And yet, every winter, when the snow settled and the skies turned pale and cruel, something returned. Ghost had stayed. He had not followed the team back to Anchorage. He had not boarded the last chopper or responded to Nora's quiet calls. Instead, he had turned toward the rising wind and walked back to the tomb, one paw after another, calm and silent. There, beside the stone marker, he had laid down and kept watch. One day, 2, then a week, then longer. Seasons changed and Ghost remained. The once vibrant sheen of his fur dulled with time, silver frosting the edges of his muzzle. His frame, once strong and lithe, carried the stillness of age, though the fire in his eyes never faded. He became something else out there. Not a dog. Not quite a ghost. But something between. They came rarely, tourists, backcountry hikers, photographers drawn by Arctic legends or stories they half believed. And always in the coldest months, when the sky turned a muted violet and the air was thin with secrets. Some of them would find the stone. Fewer would see him. A shape in the snow, curled beside the memorial, head resting on crossed paws, unmoving. Sarah Breckenridge was one of those who did. She was 56, a widow and former nurse from Juneau, traveling alone on what she called her pilgrimage into quiet. Her silver hair was cut short beneath a red wool cap, her cheeks weathered from years of mountain air. She had kind eyes, the kind that saw beyond the surface. Sarah had lost her husband to cancer 3 winters earlier, and since then had taken to solitary hikes in places no one else would go, searching not for answers, but for presence. She found the stone unexpectedly. It wasn't marked on her map. She hadn't planned to come this way. But a trail of paw prints, clear, recent, impossibly straight, had caught her eye and drawn her off course. They led her through a narrow gully of brittle ice and frozen moss, toward a silent clearing framed by skeletal birch trees. There stood the monument, snow creeping up its flanks, dark symbol faint but visible. And there, beside it, lay a dog, large, still, watching. She stopped. The German shepherd raised his head and blinked slowly. His fur was thin along the flanks now, tail curled neatly around him. But his posture was regal, aware. Sarah, out of habit more than courage, knelt slowly, offering a gloved hand. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered. "You all alone out here?" Ghost did not move forward. He did not retreat. He simply acknowledged her, calm, accepting. Then, with a deep breath that fogged the air before him, he laid his head back down. Sarah sat with him for nearly an hour. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. The silence between them was a kind of understanding. When she finally stood to leave, the dog lifted his head again, watched her go, and remained. Months later, she would tell a ranger back in Anchorage about it. "There's a dog guarding a grave up there," she'd say. "He's old, but he's still watching." But no one else would find him. In time, his body would no longer be there. The years caught up to him. The snow covered all. But even now, hikers who stray too far north sometimes report strange things. They speak of seeing wolf tracks in the snow, too large, too precise. Of hearing soft paw falls behind them in places where no animals should roam. And a few say they saw something more, a dog, golden-eyed, resting beside a stone with a mark no one can translate. And always, when they approach, it vanishes. But once, a visitor, an old man named Ron Holloway, ventured closest of all. He claimed to have walked within 5 feet of the stone. Claimed he saw the dog clearly. "He was watching me," Ron said, "like he was waiting to make sure I didn't touch what wasn't mine." And when he bent to look at the snow, the dog had disappeared. But where it had lain, there was a single paw print. Still warm. In the frozen silence of the Arctic, where men once dared to touch what was never meant for them, one German shepherd named Ghost chose to stay behind. Not because he was ordered, not because of instinct, but because of something deeper, faith, a memory beyond time, a devotion beyond words. He was not just a dog. He became a guardian, a quiet sentinel of what should remain untouched. Perhaps Ghost never read the Bible, but his life was a living prayer, unspoken, unwavering, and pure. And the message he leaves behind for all of us in this noisy, restless world is simple yet powerful. Sometimes it's not intelligence or strength that protects what matters. Sometimes it's loyalty, stillness, and silent faith. In our daily lives, each of us faces gates of our own, choices, mysteries, burdens we can't always explain. Let Ghost's story remind us, not everything must be solved. Some things are meant to be guarded, to be prayed over, to be trusted in God's hands. We may not always see God directly, but perhaps He shows up through the quiet protectors among us, the ones who choose to stay, watch, and love without needing recognition. If you believe Ghost's story is a quiet miracle from God, type Amen in the comments and say a prayer for all the silent souls still guarding the sacred things of this world. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that God still moves through loyalty, stillness, and grace. Play button, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story that touches the heart. May God bless you, your loved ones, and those who keep the faith even in the coldest places. Comment Amen if you believe loyalty can be a form of divine miracle.